What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another highly combustible reaction. We're about to learn today. We're there, Frisian Vikings on the Faroe Islands. You wanted it. We're here with it. Go show history with Hilbert, all the love of the world. Let's see what we got.
Warning, this video contains poorly pronounced Faroese, 2020 leather jacket wearing Hilbert, folk metal, and a very good doggo. Stay tuned.
The Faroe
That's a great intro. Now I'm looking forward to all of the above. Well, obviously, here we got the 2020 leather jacket wearing Hilbert.
Islands aren't really the kind of place you'd expect to be finding many Frisians. They're in between Iceland, Norway, and the Shetland Isles. It's quite cold, it's quite windy, there's a lot of sheep here, in fact more sheep than people. But there is actually a great legend about the Frisians right here.
That's kind of crazy. I've never been to a place where there's more sheep than people.
In this village on Stremoy, in the village of Kirkjubø. Dat is hem.
As 2020 Hilbert explained, the Faroe Islands are situated in the North Atlantic Ocean, roughly equidistant between Iceland and Norway, with Scotland the closest other landmass to the south. The Faroe Islands were largely first inhabited by the Norse, who probably kicked the Irish off the Isles, although did you know that there was also another group involved potentially in the settlement of the Faroes, and these were the Frisians. So in today's video, let's find out a little bit more. Well, luckily the band Baldurs Draumar, who are themselves from Friesland and make music about Frisian history, particularly about the Middle Ages, have just released a new album called Njord. This new album, consisting of some 10 amazing new songs, cover the Frisians who went to the Faroe Islands. And so in today's video, with kind permission of the band, we'll be going through some of the songs that talk about the
this
stories
is going to be a
of
super
Frisians in the
intriguing
Faroe
video.
Islands, starting of course by looking at the first song and the title track, Njord. Njord is of course the anglicised version of the Old Norse god of the sea, Njordir, who is shown here in this manuscript. Now, we don't know a great deal about the religion of the heathen Frisians before their own Christianization, but what we can infer is that they will have had a similar pantheon and beliefs to many of the gods being worshipped in Scandinavia. And of course, if these are Frisians in the Faroe Islands, it's likely they also had encountered Norse paganism on the way. It's possible too that Njord is related to the more continental Germanic god of Nerthus or Nerta, who is also mentioned later on in the album. Now, this song, as well as the next song in the album, Dus op zee, which means at home on the sea or at home at sea, both talk a lot about the seafaring abilities of the Frisians, for which they were particularly famous during the early and later Middle Ages. The Frisians have been particularly remembered as very
say, the band sounds freaking amazing. I'm just throwing that out there.
Seafarers pursuing maritime trade, going down the Rhine, over the Channel across to Britain and Ireland, up into Scandinavia, as well as through to the Baltic and probably beyond, especially if they also reach the Faroe Islands. But as well as this mercantile focus, the Frisians were also quite famous for being pirates, possibly even joining in with Viking raids at various points, as well as being quite famous pirates and robbers later on in the Middle Ages. And this is certainly how they've been remembered in the Faroe Islands in various songs, games, and folk tales, which in Faroese all refer to the Frisians, whether as Frisian poems or simply by the name of the Frisians or Frisians. A whole genre is built around it. And finally, also a kind of Frisian game that is played by Faroese children about Frisian pirates coming to take people away as slaves or hostages. In almost all these
I'm thinking we need some more movies or television shows about this.
stories, what is shared is this idea that the Frisians are a pagan bunch that have come across the sea and are incredibly warlike. In fact, very much how the rest of Europe tends to portray the Vikings. In the Faroe Islands and a lesser extent in Iceland, that role is instead given to the Frisians, perhaps because as a newly Christianized group, they didn't really want to admit that their ancestors had been busy on Viking expeditions as pagans, and so Frisians made good stand-ins for that. A particular bunch of Frisians who may either have left the region around 1040 or possibly earlier when it was conquered by the Franks are said to have settled on the southern island of Suðuroy in a settlement called Akraberg, where they had a kind of Frisian enclave and didn't mix with the other Faroese Christianized population, but maintained very much their own traditions and crucially also their own pre-Christian pagan religion here.
So the legend goes that when the Frisians were defeated by the Franks, many of the Frisians didn't want to live under this new Christian kingdom, and so they decided to set out onto the ocean in their boats, and like the Vikings would later on, they went around raiding and plundering before deciding to settle here in the Faroe Islands. Now the island they settled on is the most southerly of the Faroe Islands. It's called Suðuroy, which is the South Island in the Old Norse that it's derived from. And so for a long time there was a colony of Frisians living on the island side by side with the Christian Faroese that were there, obviously the descendants of Norwegians and those from Ireland and Shetland that had come before.
Baldur Straumar on their new album also have a song about Akraberg, here more spelled in the Frisian way.
I kind of feel like I need this album. That's what I feel like.
Another of the songs, called Yule, also has a connection with a story about the Frisians. Now this word Yule is the Frisian for the English Yule, which is of course very similar, which is the name given to the mid-winter feast that was often celebrated in pre-Christian and indeed following Christian times as well. The story goes that around Christmas, villagers from the northern village of Eyi invited the Frisians up to spend a Christmas feast with them, but that during the drinking and the feasting, a fight broke out between the Frisians and between the inhabitants of the village, which resulted in one of the villagers being killed by the Frisians, just creating bad blood between them.
He just said one of the villages was killed or one of the villagers? Because if you just like, yo, we went to a party that got a little crazy, so we wiped out a village.
Being killed by between the inhabitants of the village, which resulted in one of the villagers being killed by the Frisians.
I was like, holy hell.
Creating bad blood between them and the Northern Islanders, something that will come up later in the story. As these are legends, some people date this story to happening around 1300, while others put this story a little bit later. In any case, the piratical nature of the Frisians would be very important, as the Faroe Islands were torn apart by a civil war around this time, pitting the Northern Islanders against the Southern Islanders. And it appears that after having lost in battle, the Southern Islanders called on the Frisians with 2 of their Viking-like ships to come to their aid and fight against the Northerners. It's known that the Northerners were being led by a Bishop Erlundur around this time. However, other people claim that this happened after the Black Death hit the Faroe Islands, which was around 1350. So, of course, both things can't be true if they involve the same characters. But when does that ever get in the way of a good story?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I don't care if only part of it's true. I don't care if all of it's true. I love some tales. Give me anything. Give me tall tales. Give me fantasy. Give me truth. Whatever the case may be. If it's a cool story, I want to hear it. Like, we need more pirate things. We need more Viking things. It's not only intriguing, like, it's not only gets exciting and oh my God, it's action packed, but it also, like, there is a connection to history. And there was a lot of these things that were done. So I'm totally for any of the stories that still survive. We've listened to a lot of the old style like music, all these folk tales. It's fascinating to me. It's almost like an alternate reality to my own.
They lived happily until the plague came, sort of around the 13th century, and that all the Frisian families died of the plague apart from one, and this was the farmer of HxCReact, and this is the name of one of the farms that was there. He and his sons were left over, and those were the only Frisians left on the Faroe Islands, but they would be the most famous Frisians on these islands for what was about to happen next. The plague had been very hard for everyone on the Faroe Islands, and soon there was a war between those from the south, so we presume those living on Suðuroy, and the rest of the Faroe Islands, between the southerners and the northerners. And during this war, the northerners seem to have won the first battle and defeated the southerners. But following this point, the southerners decided to choose the farmer from HxCReact, so the last of the Frisians living on Suðuroy, as their leader, because it was legend that he was very strong as a bull, while the northerners chose as their leader the bishop from Kirkjubu, who was also apparently an incredibly strong, fearsome man. Now, the second battle that they fought between one another was won by the southerners under the leadership of the Frisians. They also had help apparently from two of these drakar, so these Viking-like ships, although of course we're after the Viking Age at this point. And so the bishop from the north decided to flee here to Kirkjubu and to hope that he would be safe here. But as the legend goes, he would not be safe here at all.
These events are captured in perhaps...
So imagine you sailed to this place, you set up a whole life, you and all your people, and then everyone gets wiped out by the Black Plague. What do you think? I wonder what was going through their heads up until the point where he became the leader. Like,
favorite song.
this has so much storytelling to it. Like, I could sit here and just listen to tales for hours. We can sit around a campfire and tell some tales.
Album, which is called The Last Fries, which means The Last Frisian, which isn't too hard to make out in the English either.
Zij stikken van zilver en draaien van goud. Van een godshoed zo heeg, dat krabbelt het dek van wolken. Een tjerke van stingen en van hout. 4 dijlingtes lang, jocht de noord doet zijn zuid. En de groenkleur red, van het bloed van het valt. Maar door hier de Fries was zijn man schepen uit. De biskop zien steen, maar de reuze zwan, hij neemt handen op, ja, boeten er mij, en vangen hem in varing.
So the church for which Kirkjubu is
That's the
actually
good
named, though
doggo.
I think in Faroese it should be pronounced something like Chitjubu or something like that, was actually a point of contention. Now, it's obviously in ruins behind me today, and it might have looked something in a similar way in the time of the story because it was under construction. Now, the problem was that we are here in the more northern part of the Faroe Islands on Streymoy, but the southerners, so from Suðuroy, also had to pay for the construction of this church, for which they weren't too happy because remember, they were fighting the northerners at this time. So the southerners weren't too fond of the bishop who came here, who was leading the northerners when he decided to come here. And that's why when the victorious southerners showed up, they thought maybe it's time to get rid of the troublesome bishop. But of course, for the Christian southern Faroese of Suðuroy, killing a bishop was not the done thing. And if you killed a bishop, that meant, you were throwing away your chances to getting into heaven. However, for the pagan Frisian that was still living there, the farmer and his 7 sons, that wasn't an issue because he didn't believe anyway. And so they asked the Frisian farmer of HxCReact to come here and to kill the bishop for them. Now, of course, the bishop knew when he saw this huge Frisian and his 7 sons coming that this meant trouble. So he decided to climb up on one of these walls with a big axe. And so he hid on top of the wall with his axe while the Frisians were outside. Now, despite being heathens, they still thought, actually, this is a sacred place and it's a huge man with a big axe. We're not going to go up on the wall. And so the Frisians and the Southerners, they decided to sit outside the walls. They ate all the livestock that was here that was meant to feed the people working on the church.
Starve him out.
And they sat and they waited for the bishop while he was up that wall for 3 days and for 3 nights. But after succumbing to the hunger, the bishop fell on the third day. And when he fell, the Frisians were waiting for him, and they hacked him to death at the bottom of these walls. And so ended the life of the bishop of Kirkjubø. So this is, of course, a legend. We're not sure how much of this is true. Now, I think it's personally fairly likely that there was a kind of Frisian community here, because there are several stories here on the Faroe Islands that have survived, and also ones that have gone over back to Friesland and other areas, telling about Frisians who came to live here on the Faroe Islands. Now, unfortunately, there are no Frisian words or cognates in the Faroese language that have been discovered yet. Of course, they might be hidden in there, and there are a few place names that might connote that they were connected to Frisians in some way, shape or form. But it's not completely unthinkable that they would have come here. Of course, they were very maritime people. We know there were Frisians trading with Iceland even later in the Middle Ages, and of course with Scandinavia and places around Britain and Ireland too. So it's not 100% unthinkable, although how much of the events here with a bishop climbing up a wall and waiting up there, and some heathen Frisians conveniently being on the southern island to batter his head in, not entirely sure, but it's a fun story nonetheless.
It's a damn fun
The
story.
legend goes that after the Black Death had ravaged the Frisian community on Akraberg, the farmer and his sons and any remaining Frisians left the settlement and instead moved to nearby Sumba. Now, what's interesting is that while the Frisians as a community disappeared into the Faroese population, the population of Sumba to this day actually do claim a partial descent from the Frisians. And so the end of the Last Fries talks about how the last Frisians, well, they never really disappeared, and they actually came up into the population of the Faroe Islands, and even more so into their stories and their tales, and indeed even into their games. And the last thing I'd like to end on is a kind of game that is played on the Faroe Islands, often with children, where one person pretends that they have been captured by a band of Frisian pirates, and one team are the Frisian pirates who wish to get a ransom for this person, and the other team play as the family of the one who has been taken hostage. And the idea behind it is there are certain rules about what is said in the back and forth dialogue between the two groups, and the rule is basically to pretend that no ransom will be paid, either because they're too poor or because they don't care about the person that has been taken hostage. And in this way, the Frisians are remembered in this piratical way on the Faroe Islands in this children's game, as well as in the aforementioned sagas and tales that have been recorded about various places where the Frisians were and where they interacted. Very interesting stuff, so let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed this video, and do check out Balderstraumar's new album all about this topic, about the Frisians on the Faroe Islands. I really enjoyed making this video, and I hope you guys have enjoyed the topic. Balderstraumar's new album I'm really enjoying listening to as well, so I do recommend you give it a listen, as well as checking out some of the sources in the description below, as there is more information about the Frisians on the Faroe Islands to be found there. Tune in again next Friday for my next video, possibly something about the Dutch in the American Civil War, or it could be a different video entirely. Check out some of the links in the description below to check out other videos that are on similar topics around the Frisians or the Vikings, or more specifically about the Faroe Islands. And let me know what kind of videos would you like to see in the future around these topics. I do try and get back to some of the comments, so I hopefully will be seeing some of you down below. Anyway, until then, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History. On Shen.
Hey, definitely get over and show history with Hilbert, all the love of the world. I'm super intrigued. Like, I don't want it to be over. I want to hear more tall tales. I want to hear this kind of stuff. You could seriously create an entire television series, multiple seasons, based on that story that we just heard right there. And I would totally be there to watch it. Go show Hilbert all the love of the world. Hit the like button if you liked it. The dislike button, but it won't believe you. Tell the next one of Mildly Combustible. You guys be happy, healthy, safe. I love you to the moon and back. Peace.